So good evening, everyone, and you're very, very welcome. And I extend a very personal, very warm welcome to everyone. As you've heard Trevor said, I'm Kath McCourt. I'm the President of the Commonwealth Nurses and Midwives Federation. And this event has been organised by NLC, Commonwealth and European forums. And obviously a great thanks to Trevor for all the work you've done in organising it, particularly because this is the year 2020, the World Health Organization Year of the Nurse and the Midwife. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing Nightingale's legacy, Crimea to COVID-19. But just one or 2 points, please, before we start. Please be aware that this event is being recorded, and can all of the attendees stay on mute unless they want to speak or they are asked a question. We have a number of members and guests joining us tonight from all 4 countries of the United Kingdom, from the 3 Crown dependencies of Guernsey, Jersey and the Isle of Man, and the Crown dependencies, the British overseas territories from the Commonwealth, from Europe, from the United States of America and the Middle East. And I think I heard earlier there was someone there from Canada. You're all very, very welcome. I'm also delighted to say that we have the President of the International Council of Nurses, Annette Kennedy, with us this evening, and the President of the Order of Nurses of the Lebanon, Mina Doumit, who I'm very honoured to have with us this evening. We do have some apologies from members of the House of Commons and the House of Lords. However, I would like to mention a particular a set of apologies that came in from His Excellency Kamlesh Sharma. Kamlesh Sharma was the former Secretary General of the Commonwealth, and he sends his very best wishes to everyone this evening and apologises for not being able to join us. However, I'm really excited and very interested to hear what Anne-Marie has to say tonight. And I have the great pleasure of handing over to Dame Betty Kershaw, who is going to be our chair this evening. So over to you, Dame Betty. Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me? Yes. Anne-Marie Rafferty is the Professor of Health Policy and former Dean of the School of Nursing and Midwifery at King's College, London. She is the current President of the Royal College of Nursing. She is a highly acclaimed nurse, a historian, a health workforce expert and a policy researcher, graduating from Edinburgh University in Social Science with Nursing Studies and from Nottingham University with an MPhil in Surgery. She's the very first nurse to be awarded a DPhil from Oxford University and is one of the first to be elected to fellowship of the Academy of Medical Sciences. She's also a fellow of both the Royal College of Nursing and the American Academy of Nursing. She was made Commander of the British Empire in 2008 for services to healthcare and served on the Prime Minister's Commission on the Future of Nursing and Midwifery from 2008 to 2010. 2008, sorry, Anne-Marie, in 2010. She received the Nursing Times Leadership Award and the Health Services Journal Top 100 Clinical Leaders Award. In 2018, she was included in the list of the 70 most influential nurses since the NHS was founded in 1948. Professor Rafferty was inducted into the Sigma Theta Tau's International Hall of Fame for research, and only this year was elected founding director of the European Nursing Research Foundation. I will now, on everybody's behalf, invite Professor Rafferty to give her lecture, Nightingale's Legacy, Crimea to COVID-19. She has kindly agreed to take questions, and you will need to ask your questions at the end through chat box. Anne-Marie, it's a pleasure to have you with us, and we look forward to your lecture. Thank you.
Please unmute, Anne-Marie.
Anne-Marie, you're still muted. Can you unmute?
Right, is that
perfect?
Good, sorry about that glitch. I was just about to say I was absolutely thrilled, rather bowled over and intimidated by the stellar calibre of this great company, and of course also a transcontinental gathering of these nursing and collegial clans. So I'm just going to move my slides up a bit, but it's absolutely thrilling to be hosted by the National Liberal Club and by the Commonwealth Nurses and Midwives Association, and to have our guests from the ICN and indeed, of course, from the Order of Nurses in Lebanon, who are doing such splendid work under very, very difficult conditions. So it's my pleasure to talk tonight about this kind of transition, if you like, and the way in which Nightingale's legacy has been embedded in our current and contemporary practice. And owe great debt of gratitude to some of my collaborators from previous studies. I'm going to quote some of the data that we have generated through a large multinational study in particular, and show how it feeds through to some of the contemporary challenges in workforce today. But I also want to take the opportunity just to give you a bit of an insight into, you know, what made Nightingale tick really as a character, and of course as a celebrity, which is what she became in her own lifetime. To look a little at her contribution to nursing and beyond, because I realise we have an audience which extends beyond nursing. So I hope some of our colleagues who are not nurses will actually appreciate some of these reflections. And then to consider her enduring appeal, why is she still relevant to us today? And I thought this would be just quite a fun slide, really, a sort of Warholian version of Nightingale, because she is a celebrity, and of course Andy Warhol is that most celebrated promoter of celebrity, including his own, it has to be said. But this also is, I guess, designed to demonstrate that there are many faces to Florence Nightingale, and she was a very, very complex character. And no one could really do justice to the breadth of scholarship. There's a 16-volume history, for example, of Nightingale's works, including some original translations that our Canadian colleagues have been working tirelessly on. And indeed, Mark Bostridge's magisterial biography, published in 2010, I think still is the kind of landmark biography, although perhaps for a more antiquarian interest, we could go back to Cook and Woodham Smith. This is an edited collection that my colleague and dear friend Siobhan Nelson and myself, we produced as a kind of updating of Nightingale and some of the more recent historiographic and contemporary work in 2010, which was, of course, 150 years celebrating our faculty at King's, which is the direct descendant of the original Nightingale School, but also 100 years since Nightingale's death. But just to give you an insight and a sense of the prodigious intellect that Nightingale had and her interest, the reach of her interest, she produced musings on philosophy and theology that condensed into her suggestions for thought. And they're well worth reading now in paperback for anyone who is struggling with you know, their religious convictions, as she was wrestling with hers in the 19th century, a period of significant convulsion within the Anglican Church itself. So one way to think about Nightingale is, in fact, she did, of course, spend rather a lot of her time at home, most particularly in this left-hand quadrant here, which was her apartment, her flat that she rented in South Street. And that was really where she spent the bulk of her life, in London, in Mayfair. But you can see from the other two properties that the one in the upper third is Lea Hurst in Derbyshire, which now I gather is it was a nursing home, and now it's actually, I think it's a hotel. I think you can even go and rent if you're so inclined. I think it would be quite thrilling to do so. You can actually go and stay in Nightingale's own bedroom. So that I think that's a fantastic thing to do. And it's been very well preserved. I think that the memorabilia by its owner, Peter May. So the family themselves, the Nightingales and the Shaw Smiths, from which they were descended, were actually industrialists originally in Derbyshire, and that's where the family fortune came from. And it was an inheritance of from her father's uncle that really made it possible for them to branch out and to build this splendid property in Hampshire. And that property itself was really designed once her father, who was also a Liberal MP, so of course we'd be delighted to think that we were hosting this talk by the National Liberal Club, that it was really designed to be a kind of place where they could, if you like, flaunt the kind of cultural capital and political capital of the family, invite the great and the good of the day for dinner, and of course cultivate connections and conversation. And it was there that the adolescent and early adulthood of Florence was spent in the company of some of the intellectual and the political aristocracy of the day. So including Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. They didn't visit there, but she visited them after the Crimea in Balmoral. And so, interestingly, I mean, Charles Darwin and Charles Babbage and the great writers of the day, Mrs. Gaskell, great scientists, were frequent visitors to the Nightingale homes. And not insignificantly, I think other men who were going to play a major role in her life, at the top left there, Lord Palmerston, and underneath Sidney Herbert became Minister of War and eventually recruited her to take her party of nurses out to the Crimea. Lord Palmerston eventually became Prime Minister, and it was fortuitous that both of their family houses, their country houses, were located on either side of the Embley Park, the Nightingale property in Hampshire. So what could be more propitious than to be sandwiched between the Prime Minister and perhaps during that period of great political ferment that led up to the Crimean War, Secretary for War himself, who was also a great friend, and they met in Florence, the Herberts. So it was a very privileged background that Florence had. She was very well educated, she was fluent in 5 languages, and of course she's best known for her quantitative skills, both in statistics and in mathematics. But as I was alluding to earlier on, she was someone who was on a kind of mission and deeply troubled by what she was going to do with her life, and kept asking her question, how could I usefully contribute to the betterment of humankind? And I mean, as a child, she was very keen on helping the poor in the villages around Derbyshire and looking after animals, and she was a great collector and classifier. And that's the great sort of obsession of the 19th century, was developing different taxonomies. And of course, ultimately, she applied her taxonomical skills to classifying hospital statistics. But she was very interested in nature, and she was a conchologists. She was very knowledgeable about shells. She had a collection of shells. In fact, when I was at Nottingham, they were in Nightingale Hall, and quite splendid they were too. So, you know, a woman of many complex parts, but I think this questing that she had, that meant she was also seeking to understand what could she do to fulfill God's mission, because she was a very committed Christian. How could she use her life in a way that would both be an expression of God's mission and his will for her, although she also interestingly used to refer to me like this as, I guess, feminists, and the feminist theologians would love it, referred to God as she. So she was very much in the contemporary non-binary mode of expression too. So a really exploratory and incredibly productive intellect that ranged over a whole, swathe of different subjects. But they all kind of came together and distilled ultimately into nursing. I mean, she wasn't just interested in intellectual explorations and exercises for their own benefit. Far from it. In fact, she wanted really to do and dedicate her life to doing something practical as well. And I think that's really ultimately what led her to nursing. But she was, you know, sometimes Nightingale is portrayed as, you know, someone who was advocating conformity to authority and so forth. Well, she was anything but. I mean, she was a fierce critic. I mean, often most significantly of herself. But she was a nonconformist and a rebel, and her initial rebellion was really against the enforced idleness of Victorian women, as she wrote in this quite expansive novella called Cassandra, which in fact she wrote in the 1850s, but wasn't really published until 1920 as a kind of long suffix to a history of the women's suffrage movement by Ray Strachey, who was the sister of Lytton Strachey, who had, of course, if you're aware of his writings, wrote The Great Victorians, and well, did a bit of a hatchet job on Florence, and wasn't the kindest. I mean, he was a sort of iconoclast of his age, an agent provocateur. But this work actually bears rereading in the contemporary version, which it still can be found in. And I think this was really one of to understand and get into her psyche, you have to understand what really motivated her. And I think she just despised and had no truck with the waste of human talents, and particularly those of women who were servants to their their households, and ultimately perhaps to their husbands. So which was a role that she herself rejected, notwithstanding several proposals of marriage. So she chose a really difficult path for herself. She wasn't one who wanted to have an easy life at all. And I mean, this is how we tend to think about Florence, as the lady with the lamp, and of course lionized in Longfellow's poem as the shadowy character who's tending to the sick in the Crimean barracks themselves. But if it hadn't been for one of the Times journalists, William Howard Hastings, actually decrying and declaiming the scandal of the conditions during the Crimea, and writing to the Times. And it's probably one of the first, I guess, opportunities for a war journalist to exert such potent influence over government policy. Had it not been for his etchings and indeed his very provocative writing in the Times, finding its way into the drawing rooms of the British public and outraging in turn the politicians of the day, and shaming the government really, he was saying, you know, here we are in the Crimea with more devastation through neglect and of our soldiers, but we have yet, you know, from the French, the Sœurs de Charité, who are, you know, heroines of the moment and doing a splendid job in looking after the poor, and yet the British Army is left completely to its own devices. And, you know, this was something that Nightingale was able to demonstrate through her gifts, not just in design, but in, which I'll talk about a little later, but in actually being able to marshal and then summarize data and depict a narrative in graphic form, and even inventing, you know, infographics. Now, I think she would be very much at home with the contemporary in terms of our love of pictograms and infographics as a way of conveying a lot of information in a very economical form. And she was aware of very much, you know, the first principle, I suppose, of communication is understanding your audience. And she understood that decision makers and politicians in particular had short attention spans, and that in order to really capture their imaginations, that you had to be able to really use pictures to tell that story in a very abbreviated and telegraphic form. But in her quantification and the telling of that story, she was helped, and of course she was very influenced by a Belgian statistician called Adolphe Quetelet. Some of you who are familiar with the study of diabetes may be familiar with the Quetelet index, which he actually invented, but which is in fact predicated on something he's more famous for, I think, which is inventing the mean in statistics, and ergo standard deviations, which, you know, becomes a sort of way in which we understand difference, and so and distribution of those differences. And so he was really interested in society and behavior and criminology, you know, what makes people commit acts of a criminal nature. And in doing so, he coined this phrase of l'homme moyen, the average man, wanted to compare those who were outside that distribution in order to make assessments about social behavior in society. And in fact, Nightingale's book of his statistics, L'Homme Moyen, is in the British Library, and it's got little marginalia which she put in her comments. It's in the Nightingale collection there, which I think there's something in the region of 10,000 different items, and, you know, hundreds of letters. She was a prolific letter writer and correspondent. I mean, just unbelievably a sort of workaholic type energy for getting work done. And I mean, this slide is really just to demonstrate how she believed in the power of evidence as persuasion, as a form of rhetoric. It was there, you know, not something that was self-evident. It had to have a kind of narrative quality in order to reach those deeper recesses of the brain and actually persuade. And of course, that's something which we're very familiar with today in the sort of nudge economics, behavioral economics, and in political science as well. But, you know, perhaps the most celebrated of her works is Notes on Nursing, and published in 1959, and it almost immediately became a blockbuster. And her audience here was not really nurses per se, who didn't exist in the numbers, who would be the avid consumers of this, but the women who were the heads of households, who would real role it was and duty it was seen to be to look after the sick in their homes. And it's full of all sorts of beautiful and very elegantly expressed kind of epigrammatic hints of wisdom and on care, and the detail with which you can tell she was an excellent nurse herself by the detail which she and the depth charges which she sort of explodes on the page around how to look after people and their comfort measures, and in all facets of care, how to prepare the environment, you know, the use of light, the use of fresh air, the little delicacies that you could cook through invalid cookery to tempt people who had lost their appetites with having something to eat and keep them hydrated, and the use of flowers and art in order to, you know, spark up and brighten up the sick room. So I think she was someone who was emotionally incredibly intelligent, as well as having a formidable intellect and sort of multiple talents as well. And I think if we were trying to modernize notes on nursing, you know, certainly self-care and looking after the chronic sick, you know, developing a kind of vade mecum along the lines of nursing, you know, nursing in the home and domestic nursing and looking after yourself and your family better. I mean, we've all seen that during COVID. I think it could be a kind of coda for COVID and how to look after yourself and your loved ones really well. So I think it does have, there's a demand for updating in terms of our contemporary sort of culture. But of course, she's also very famous for her views on hygiene and ventilation and designing hospitals. 1863, she wrote notes on hospitals, and St Thomas's here by the Thames. I mean, she was an opponent of St Thomas's. She didn't want it to be built on the Thames, which she thought was just a filthy, squalid sewer. And however, that was one battle she didn't win. And here you can see the pavilion type structure is designed to avoid cross-infection, and the big windows and allowing for ventilation. She even in that book designed the cubic meterage between beds so that you'd avoid cross-infection, and went as far as even prescribing what kind of plaster should be used on the walls, the actual material signs, which we know now, of infection control. Should it be this type of plaster or another type of plaster, one that would not attract carbonic acid, which was something which miasmaticists, people who believed in miasma as contagion, believed was the sort of noxious fumes that putrefying matter gave off. So you wanted to avoid the carbonic acid. And equally, what mattresses would be made of. Was a straw versus a horsehair mattress more conducive to or repellent of infection itself? So it's this kind of capacity to take in the broad, big macro picture, but then sort of swoop down into the most exquisite detail that is so impressive about her grasp of reality and grasp of detail. And we see that decanted, you know, here into a museum, and that bears her name, and you know how she actually was an architect and a designer par excellence. I mean, she wrote first of all about the importance of hygiene in notes on nursing, and of course that's now such a major part of COVID prevention. Everywhere we go, we're sanitizing our hands, and I mean, she was really one of the first exponents of that. But here she is, and we're very aware, I think, about the importance of the hospital environment as a kind of a driver of quality of care, and indeed of quality of patient outcomes as well as workforce outcomes. That's certainly work which I've had the privilege and pleasure of being involved in. And it's interesting to think about bringing it somewhat up to date, that looking at the demand and for labour moving forward in the future, the Bureau of Labour Statistics in the States recently identified there were 3 major areas. Of course, this was pre-COVID, that were going to be growth areas, and similarly work that WHO, ICN and others have been involved in, have identified some of those drivers. It's care, computers and clean energy. And we've got the UN analysis of employment as well as the state of the world's nursing report, which the ICN and others have been involved in. And that's important because of the demands that are going to be increasing. This is now still relevant because it's really about an aging population and demand, and with people having more things wrong with them. And with COVID, we're going to have a long kind of legacy of COVID, which is compounded in its complexity by comorbidities as well. And thinking about nursing now, which has been a very strong collaborator in the Year of the Nurse and the Midwife. The global pandemics were chronic disease before COVID itself. We see these burgeoning and frightening rising tides of prevalence of chronic diseases as diabetes, not just a disease of rich countries or high income countries, but increasingly and worryingly of lower and middle income countries with the epidemiological transition. This is just a book which we published earlier on in the year that, for those who are interested, provides a kind of analysis of the role of nursing in Europe, mainly looking at how nursing, what it contributes to strengthening health systems. It's an essential part, as we know, of the infrastructure of health systems. And so weakening that has systems pay a major penalty in terms of their resilience. And our evidence as well has, I think Nightingale would approve here of the function that she helped to birth. I think that she helped to support the training of, although not in person, because she never stepped over the threshold of St Thomas's. She corresponded with probationers, and she was something of a remote and distant figure. But I think her kind of commitment and conviction about the value of nursing, we've managed to translate that into strong epidemiological evidence, which she herself, of course, was involved in generating as well. And similarly, it's not just the numbers of nurses, it's also the capability, the quality of the workforce that counts. Our research published in The Lancet demonstrates that better educated nurses also saves patient lives. And I think, the way that Nightingale herself was interested in looking at health systems, the way that she was keen to ensure there were standardized approaches to classifying hospital statistics, would have been had those been implemented, would have been a great help to us in COVID times as well, in actually comparing health systems and mortality across. And this is a kind of bit of modelling from one of our papers that basically, I think, in a sort of abbreviated form, demonstrates how nurses save lives, literally, that every one patient added in workload terms translates to a 7% increase in mortality in common surgeries. Every 10% increase in improving bachelor's education levels is associated with a benefit in outcomes. And if you were to modulate, if you were to have a pan-European or just a national, that would be great, a national workforce strategy that was based on data and modelling of workload, we and education together, we could save, we can quantify the benefits of those lives, 3,500 would be saved. But of course, we're grappling with a significant number of challenges, particularly in COVID times, increasing levels of anxiety, depression, we know from early studies, and of course burnout, which is a predictor of intention to leave. And RCN's own work itself, recent survey demonstrated that a third of nurse respondents demonstrated that they were intending to leave the profession. And it's actually worse in social care, which is even more frightening because it's in a more fragile state. So it's, I think really we're looking at a kind of perfect storm here brewing, which we've got to be fighting against in terms of the direct political action as a union that we need to be taking to ensure that those conditions, those predicted conditions, do not translate into, further disaster for patients. And I think Nightingale would also approve of our attempts to use design principles, not just in bricks and mortar, but in actually designing improved quality for patient care and involving patients and their loved ones in their experiences, using that to improve outcomes. So I think those methodologies she would be very heartened by. And just here, including a slide about the millennials and the next generation on whom we're going to become increasingly reliant. I mean, student nurses have done sterling and amazing work during COVID as well. And we need to maintain those high levels of motivation because, they also, they're not turned off by, they're actually turned on by nursing and really showing that there's an uptick in nursing applications, which we have got to treasure, but we have to create the conditions that makes them want to stay. And that means paying people well and of course giving them an adventurous and exciting career, set of career prospects. And the Nightingale hospitals, of course, I mean, field hospitals were really what Nightingale herself was working in, are a further testament, I think, to the brilliance that she brought to hospital design. And here, could there be a more exemplary demonstration of Nightingale's ethos in action than in the Nightingale hospitals, which are now hibernating in different parts of the country? And I think the other thing to say, of course, Nightingale's contribution to home care, as a kind of co-inventor of community nursing with William Rathbone, and her support for district nursing was, which she regarded as the Star of Bethlehem, one of her prized kind of, I think, innovations. She recognised that most people were cared for in the home, as she was herself, and that was the most important locus of care, really, until the 30s, until the National Health Service itself tipped the balance. But now, I think, with COVID and isolation and so forth, home is coming into its own, but our infrastructure of support is, definitely fragile and rickety. And we've heard lots of stories of district nurses struggling to get access to, and community nurses to PPE and in social care and in care homes. So, we've got to try and prevent any further disasters on the scale that we saw in the first wave of COVID happening again. But I think just to finish off, really, what motivated Nightingale was this really hard and high standard that she held herself to as well. Her success was she never took or gave any excuse. That was what she really was. She was really driven by. And I think actually she would have, this is just a little bit of a sort of a joke in many ways, but I mean, lockdown, she would have loved lockdown because of course she became quite a recluse, living a life, a hermetically sealed life, ultimately retreating to her home. I don't think she would have any problem at all adapting to lockdown itself, but of course she would also be issuing orders from her her bedroom and all of her the measures that we've got in today, she perhaps could claim some ownership of as well. I think the other area that she would excel and that she would really warm to, if she was going to be here, walked, you know, was resurrected, I think she would be very interested in, and she would want to be a data scientist, a nurse data scientist, and she would be not only using AI, machine learning and big data to solve everyday clinical problems, but boy, would she be designing those systems as well and really getting a piece of the action. And I think we need to shift from that, nurses as deliverers, to nurses as designers of data systems and systems of, ergo, systems of care themselves. But I think she would also be, you know, wagging a finger at the government, and she would be decrying the, perhaps, let's just say, slow start to logistics and ensuring there was sufficient PPE. I've no doubt in my mind she would be beating a hasty trail to number 10, hammering on the door and pushing all the politicians aside and basically saying, I'm in charge and you lot will answer to me. I'm going to make sure that people do have proper PPE. And I think she would counsel again, being able to make really good policy in a spirit of fear, and want us to be able to ensure that people had the kind of freedom, not living under the caution of political culture that was tramlining thinking. And I'm not making any further comments on that, but I think the way that she would exert her leadership would invite problem solving and troubleshooting that did give people the freedom to be really, really creative. And I think she would recognise the creativity that nurses bring every day to their work. I mean, brilliant problem solvers. And I think, you know, she would want those little germinal seeds to take root and flourish. A great advocate and ambassador for innovation. I've no doubt she would be setting up a fund for nurse innovation and making sure that nurses were at in the driving seat of innovation labs themselves. But finally, I think she's got to have the last word. You know, she would ensure that unless we're making progress in our nursing every year, every month, every week, take it from me, we are going back. So thank you very, very much. I hope there is no going back to what we have experienced in COVID in the first wave. Certainly, I hope we're learning lessons, we're reflecting on the past, and we're honouring the legacy that Florence, were she here today, would wish to applaud. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Anne-Marie. Trevor, it's an excellent idea to record this, because I think there's so much in it that it will merit listening to again rather more quietly, and certainly in my case with a rather lower anxiety level than I've got at the moment. And Marie, I understand you're going to take questions, and we've got 5 people in the chat room. If they'd like to ask questions through chat box, and please say who they are. The first person on the list is Annette Kennedy. Hello, Annette.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Annette.
Okay. Good afternoon, evening, everybody. It's lovely to see so many familiar faces. I'm not showing my face because I don't look too good today. But thank you so much, Anne-Marie. It was so insightful and so interesting. And as was already said, I think we would need to listen to it again. I suppose I'm going to make a few comments, seeing as you said that she was persuasive and she was a rebel and she was challenging, and that she would have been telling the government what to do. So I'm going to ask you to do the same thing. But first of all, I would just like to say that I was very fortunate to visit the museum in Istanbul in the army barracks, and it's beautifully kept. And she had so many letters written on the walls that were encouraging to student nurses, particularly. 1 or 2 of the ones that I read, they were saying that we should mentor the students, we should look after the students, and that we should certainly look after our nurses. I'm very impressed by all of that. And I know that they're going to hold some kind of a celebration towards the end of the year. Having said that, what I was going to say is that when we lobbied last year in 2019 for the year of the nurse and the midwife, we never expected this. We expected to be able to profile nurses, to celebrate and to really celebrate Florence's Nightingale's challenge, her bicentenary. But we got COVID instead, and it's put enormous pressure on nurses. And you know that between last year and this year, we were working very hard with WHO and Dr. Tedros on the state of the world's nursing. And that was the first report to come out on the state of the world's nursing. And it was supported by 191 countries. And it is a great report. The recommendations there, we have to insist and call our governments to account. They signed up to it, they have to be called to account. It looks for building capacity, it looks for building education, building leadership, inclusion and policy, better pay and conditions. And I suppose I'm challenging you and everybody else in nursing throughout the world to call on your governments to account. The second thing is in relation to COVID. And as you know, COVID has really decimated the world and changed our whole world, but it has also affected dramatically nurses. And last week, we published a report from 40 countries, and that indicated that over 1,000 nurses have lost their lives in 40 countries. Now there's 195 countries, so you can imagine how many nurses have lost their lives. Around 10% of all the people that have got COVID, 10% are healthcare workers. Actually, the WHO say 14%. So if you take that, you would say about 3 million healthcare workers have been infected. And 60% of those would be nurses, so you can guarantee that over 2 million nurses are infected. The long-term effects of that worries us dramatically because we're short 6 million nurses. So we need every single nurse we have. And I know that in England, in Ireland, and everywhere else, everybody's crying out for nurses. They're being overburdened with work and everything else. So when we did the research in the 40 countries, we wanted to know, just besides the number of infections and the number of deaths, like what was their mental and physical health, and were they getting enough PPEs, was there support and anything else? And we found that that wasn't forthcoming. They're still short PPEs, their still mental and physical health is affected. We worry about the long-term effects and that there will be huge burnout. I worry that not alone are we short the 6 million that we need to have, but that we won't be able to retain the nurses that we have, or else that if we don't call on government to support the current cohort of nurses that are in the system, we will be very badly affected. And we're heading probably towards a very harsh winter. So during the week for Patient Safety Day, that focused on healthcare workers' safety. And there was a charter launched at that on Wednesday, calling on governments to support and protect nurses, to ensure that they had PPEs and to make sure that they had occupational health. And it was seen as an occupational health injury because that's a big worry for all of us. If it's not seen as an occupational health injury, disease, then they won't be paid or they won't get long-term support, and they won't pick up all the data that's needed to see where did these nurses get it, who did they infect, what is the long-term effects of that being transferred from nurse to nurse, from nurse to doctor, from patient to patient, and we have to follow that, otherwise we're in big trouble. And as you said already, that in order to honour Florence's history, we have to rebel and we have to persuade and we have to challenge government. The health service cannot function without nurses, and all the rhetoric and praise that we've heard from politicians all over the world is unacceptable. We need actions, not words, and I'm saying to you, let's all call on governments. Thank you, Anne-Marie, so much. It was a brilliant, insightful lecture, and thank you, Trevor, for having me. And it's so nice to see so many friendly faces that I have known over many, many years.
Thank you very much, Annette. Can we move to Janet Berridge, please?
Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much, Professor Rafferty. That was very insightful. What I wanted to ask was, I understand that Florence Nightingale trained initially in Germany and then came back to London. Was there a big difference between the state of nursing in Germany and England? And was she, I have to assume she was very shocked when she went to the Crimea, because I imagine things were not as advanced there as they were in England or in Germany. How did she react to the different standards?
Well, Janet, it's a very interesting question to which there would be a very long answer, but I'll try to keep it short. I mean, you can't really talk about nursing in Germany per se, or England at the time, because there's little hotspots, aren't there? It's a very sort of inchoate profession, and Kaiserwerth am Rhein, which is with Pastor Fliedner and his wife, where she went to train, was a Lutheran denomination and deaconess organization. So that was a religious, undertaking, and and they were some of the first. I think she was attracted there because they were providing training, but it was also infused by what I call the sort of pietetics of care. She was very interested in how, this Christian ethos was being woven into and mobilized in service of humanity. And I think it was the conjunction of the two that really attracted her. I mean, there were nurses actually working, and beyond the Sarah Gamps, there's a lot of very skilled nurses also working, plague nurses and infection control in and around, Britain at the time, in little sort of pockets of private practice, and some of them attached to hospitals, really working with surgeons, particular surgeons for the aftercare. And that's partly how training hospitals got going in the numbers that they did, so that they could begin to standardize these and have that follow through community care. But it was very sort of isolated in sets of initiatives, and I don't think you could. I mean, she looked towards the standards in Kaiserwerth, but I think it was very much a kind of, it wasn't part of a broader movement which you could make generalizations on. I think it was an island of excellence on its own, rather.
Thank you very much,
Anne-Marie. Can I ask June Clark now, please, to come in? And could you introduce yourself, June? June? No. Could we move then?
Is that better? Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now, June.
Okay. Two things. First of all, the comment that I've put on the chat thing, that I'm getting rid of all my FN paraphernalia to a good home if anybody wants some. The comment that I wanted to make, and the question, is that I live in Wales, and in Wales, Betty Kershaw is revered perhaps even more than Florence Nightingale. And there are various stories about tensions in the relationship between Florence Nightingale and Betty Kershaw. Could Anne-Marie comment, what is your view on this? What is the truth of this?
I honestly don't know, June, and I wish I could give you a full and frank answer. I mean, I don't know that there's been very much work done on that topic, or indeed where does the evidence lie. But I know that another Welsh nurse, who's not really received very much attention at all, is Elizabeth Davies, who went out with the Crimean Party, and she was considered to be an excellent nurse by Nightingale. And she did actually write an autobiography. So for my money, I would be like trying to think, gosh, who else amongst the Betsy's and the Elizabeth Davies in Welsh nursing was there? And I think Elizabeth Davies her biography certainly deserves a good read through. She's been very little studied. There's one article by Anne Summers, I think, in History Workshop in about 1986. So yeah, so I can't give you a sort of more fuller answer than that, but I know that certainly Elizabeth Davis was regarded as being a highly accomplished nurse, but I don't think there were tensions between them.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. The expert on Betsy Cadwallader, who must know almost as much about Betsy as you know about Florence, is Professor Donna Mead.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, June. I'm sure we'll pick that up. Perhaps you could actually put the name on the chat room for us, on the conversation that's going on.
Dame Betty, could I ask, because of time, is it possible to go to Tim for his concluding remarks?
I'm sure it is indeed. Thank you very much. We did have two other people waiting to ask questions, Digby and Dan Duta, so they might like to put their questions in writing on the screen at the moment. Tim is going to give us a vote of thanks to both you and me, I understand, Anne-Marie, and indeed to Kath McCourt and to Trevor. Tim Jackson is a highly experienced nurse. He's a general nurse who trained in York. He's a nurse for the learning disability nurse now, and he's also a midwife. He'd worked mainly in London. He's had 40 years experience in clinical, managerial and directorship roles across organisational boundaries, both at operational and strategic level. His areas of expertise include managed care networks, oncology, transplantation, specialist palliative care, end-of-life care in the NHS and in the voluntary sector. And most recently, his work has taken him into programme development, has taken him into the Middle East and into the EU, and he's about to start working in Dublin again. Tim, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So thank you for that introduction. And again, thank you, Anne-Marie, for such an interesting discussion. And I think just in terms of some of the points you've touched on, workforce is a significant problem. There's no way of getting away from that. But I suppose just in terms of looking forward, nurses, certainly with the COVID, nurses at all levels, nurse leaders, nurse educators, students in training, but also those that have been retired and have come back into the profession, I think have seen the need to sort of literally look after patients in a very different way that has had a tremendous impact on them and been a tremendous risk. We've heard of the number of people that have, nurses, healthcare professionals that have died. But I think, you know, there's also been the psychological morbidity of, you know, will I get this when looking after patients? So I think, you know, and nurses have been created, they've not looked back, and especially around, you know, communicating with relatives, using Zoom, for instance, which Betty and I are not very good at, to communicate with patients, to have patients in the room where possible, if they've been isolated. But also, again, when patients have been actively dying and relatives have not been able to visit, they've used Zoom to sort of almost like to show that the relative is dying and is comfortable. So I think nurses have been hard to be commended, as are those that are working in residential and nursing homes, where nurses are not that readily available, but we've been, you know, care workers have taken on some of those responsibilities. And again, reflecting on notes on nursing, still relevant today. And I think when you look at some of the nursing practice that's out there, again, that's notes on nursing have been the basis of that practice. So again, I'm now going to summarise, and just to say thank you, Kath McCourt, for introducing this. Thank you again, Professor Anne-Marie Rafferty, for a fantastic talk. And again, it's really good that we're going to have this recorded. Betty, who's now a neighbour as well as a friend, thank you, Betty, for facilitating this. And again, National Liberal Club. Trevor, thank you.
And Tim, for facilitating our Zoom.
Yep, well, I was going to come on to that. So thank you, Trevor, for this. Alderman Tim McNally, who apparently is the Zoom supremo. Jonathan Broad, Marketing Manager at National Liberal Club, and Simon Roberts, Club Secretary at the Liberal Club. I think if we were at the Liberal Club now, we would be going to the terrace for something cool and refreshing. So wherever you are, I hope you have something cool and refreshing this evening. And again, the message really is stay safe, everybody. And thank you all very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Trevor, for organising it.
Thank you, Trevor. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. Excellent.
I notice I'm now in darkness. I should have opened my shutters. It was sunny earlier on. I hope it's not some sort of you know, pathetic fallacy is showing that nature is reflecting the human condition.
Bye,
Thank
everyone.
you very much. Bye-bye, everyone.
Stay safe.
Thanks.
Stay safe.
Bye.